The scorching Oklahoma sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of Tulsa as Marcus Johnson, a 35-year-old African-American man, made his way through the bustling downtown area. His crisp white shirt and tailored suit stood out among the casual attire of the lunchtime crowd. Marcus walked with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the sidewalk as he headed towards his favorite cafe for a quick bite before his afternoon meeting. Little did Marcus know that this ordinary Tuesday would soon turn into a nightmare that would shake the foundations of Tulsa's police department and spark a citywide controversy. As Marcus approached the cafe, he noticed two police officers standing near their patrol car, eyeing him suspiciously. The officers, Jack Thompson and Mike Rodriguez, had been partners for 5 years and were known for their aggressive policing tactics in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Marcus felt a familiar unease settle in his stomach. Despite his successful career as a corporate lawyer, he was all too aware of the potential dangers of being a black man in America. His father's words echoed in his mind. No matter how successful you become, son, to some, you'll always be just another black man. Trying to shake off his apprehension, Marcus reached for the cafe door. Suddenly, he heard a sharp command from behind him. "Stop right there, hands where we can see them." Marcus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he turned to face the officers, his hands raised in a gesture of compliance. Officer Thompson approached him, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus struggled to keep his composure. He knew that any sudden movement, any sign of defiance, could escalate the situation dangerously. The fear that gripped him was not just for his immediate safety, but for the potential consequences this encounter could have on his life and career. Officer Thompson's eyes narrowed as he looked Marcus up and down, his gaze lingering on the expensive watch and the quality of Marcus's suit. There was a flicker of something in the officer's eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps suspicion, at the sight of a well-dressed black man in this part of town. "We've had reports of drug activity in this area," Officer Thompson said, his voice gruff and authoritative. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." Marcus felt a surge of indignation. He knew this was a thinly veiled excuse for racial profiling, but he also knew the dangers of challenging police authority. Years of legal training battled with the raw emotion of the moment as he carefully chose his next words. "I assure you, officer, I'm not involved in any illegal activities," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm just here to get lunch before a meeting." Officer Rodriguez joined his partner, his stance aggressive. The two officers exchanged a glance, a silent communication that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He could feel the situation slipping out of his control, the weight of centuries of racial prejudice bearing down on this single moment. "We'll be the judge of that," Officer Rodriguez snapped, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his handcuffs. "Let's see some ID." With slow, deliberate movements, Marcus reached into his pocket and produced his driver's license. As Officer Thompson examined it, Marcus could see the skepticism in his eyes. The cognitive dissonance was evident. A black man in an expensive suit, claiming to be a lawyer in an area known for drug activity. It was clear that in the officers' minds, these pieces didn't fit together. "Marcus Johnson, huh?" Officer Thompson's tone was mocking, as if he couldn't believe a black man could have a legitimate profession. "And what do you do for a living, Mr. Johnson?" The condescension in the officer's voice stung, but Marcus forced himself to remain calm. He knew that losing his temper now would only confirm the officer's biases and potentially put him in even greater danger. "I'm a corporate lawyer with Davis & Williams," Marcus replied, trying to keep the anger out of his voice. He could feel a bead of sweat rolling down his back, a physical manifestation of the stress he was under. Officer Rodriguez snorted, exchanging another glance with his partner. "A lawyer? Right? And I'm the President of the United States." The dismissal of his profession, the refusal to believe that a black man could hold such a position, cut deep. Marcus had worked hard to get where he was, overcoming countless obstacles and prejudices along the way. To have his achievements so casually dismissed was a painful reminder of how far society still had to go. The situation was escalating quickly, and Marcus could feel the tension in the air. Passers-by were beginning to take notice, some slowing down to watch the confrontation unfold. Marcus could see the mixture of concern and curiosity on their faces, but no one dared to intervene. The isolation he felt in that moment was profound, surrounded by people, yet utterly alone in his struggle. "Listen," Marcus said, his voice low and controlled, fighting to keep his emotions in check. "I understand you're doing your job, but I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding. If you'd like, we can call my office to verify my identity." He hoped that this offer would diffuse the situation, that the officers would realize their mistake and let him go. But as he watched their faces harden, he knew that hope was in vain. Officer Thompson's face set in a grim expression, his decision already made. "No need for that. We're going to need you to come down to the station with us." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He felt a cold dread wash over him, the reality of the situation sinking in. He knew his rights, knew that this was an unlawful detention, but he also knew the potential consequences of resisting. Images of other black men who had been brutalized or killed by police flashed through his mind. Eric Garner, George Floyd, Philando Castile. The names of countless victims of police brutality echoed in his thoughts, a grim reminder of what could happen if this situation spiraled out of control. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his legal training kicking in, even as fear threatened to overwhelm him. He needed to establish the parameters of this interaction, to create a record of what was happening in case he needed to challenge it later. "You're being detained for questioning," Officer Rodriguez snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Now turn around and put your hands behind your back." The command hung in the air for a moment as Marcus weighed his options. He knew he had done nothing wrong, knew that this detention was baseless and likely illegal. Every fiber of his being wanted to resist, to stand up for his rights and challenge this injustice. But he also knew the risks. In that moment, Marcus made the difficult decision to prioritize his safety over his pride. With a heavy heart, Marcus complied with the officer's order. As he turned around, he caught sight of his reflection in the cafe window. The image of himself, a successful lawyer in an expensive suit, about to be handcuffed in broad daylight, was jarring. It was a stark reminder of the duality of his existence as a black man in America. No matter his achievements, to some, he would always be a suspect first. As the cool metal of the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Marcus could feel the eyes of the gathering crowd on him. The shame and humiliation of being arrested in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses was almost overwhelming. He could hear the murmurs of the onlookers, could practically feel their judgment. How quickly they seemed to accept the scene before them. A black man being arrested must have done something wrong, after all. The walk to the patrol car felt like the longest of Marcus's life. Each step was a battle against the urge to run, to resist, to shout out the injustice of what was happening. But he forced himself to remain calm, to keep putting one foot in front of the other. He knew that any resistance now would only make things worse. As the officers led him to their patrol car, Marcus caught sight of a young woman filming the incident on her phone. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Marcus saw a mix of shock and sympathy in her gaze. He silently thanked her, hoping that the video would provide evidence of the injustice he was experiencing. In that moment, that small act of witness felt like a lifeline, proof that someone had seen what was happening, that this incident wouldn't be lost in the vast sea of similar injustices that went unrecorded and unchallenged. The officers roughly pushed Marcus into the back of the patrol car. As the door slammed shut, Marcus felt a wave of claustrophobia wash over him. The confined space of the back seat, separated from the officers by a thick partition, felt like a cage. The reality of his situation hit him anew. He was powerless, at the mercy of a system that had already judged him guilty. The ride to the police station was tense and silent. Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at the blatant racial profiling, fear for his safety, and worry about the potential impact on his career all competed for dominance in his thoughts. He tried to focus on his breathing, to stay calm and clear-headed. He would need all his faculties to navigate what was to come. As they drove through the streets of Tulsa, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the history of racial tension in the city. The memories of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history, still haunted the city. While much had changed in the century since that tragic event, moments like this served as a stark reminder of how much work still needed to be done. The patrol car pulled up to the police station, an imposing brick building that loomed over the street. As Officer Thompson opened the car door and roughly pulled Marcus out, the reality of his situation hit him anew. He was about to enter a system that was stacked against him from the start. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over everything, making the scene feel surreal. The bustle of activity, officers at their desks, phones ringing, the general hum of a busy police station, created a backdrop of normalcy that felt at odds with the turmoil Marcus was experiencing. Marcus was led to an interrogation room, a stark, windowless space that felt oppressive. The harsh fluorescent lights cast unflattering shadows, making the room feel smaller than it was. Officer Thompson roughly pushed Marcus into a chair before leaving the room with his partner. Left alone, Marcus tried to calm his racing heart. He knew he needed to stay composed, to think clearly. He had defended clients in situations like this before, but being on the other side of the law was a surreal and terrifying experience. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, a constant reminder of his powerlessness in this situation. Outside the interrogation room, Officers Thompson and Rodriguez were conferring with their supervisor, Sergeant Sarah Martinez. Martinez, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, listened to their account with a growing sense of unease. She had seen her fair share of questionable arrests in her time, but something about this one didn't sit right with her. "So let me get this straight," Martinez said, her voice tight with barely contained anger. "You arrested this man based on a vague description and a hunch? Did you even bother to verify his identity?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably under his supervisor's scrutiny. He had been so sure of himself when making the arrest, but now, faced with explaining his actions, doubt began to creep in. "We were acting on information about drug activity in the area." He fit the profile. Martinez's eyes narrowed, her expression a mix of disbelief and disappointment. "The profile? You mean he was black and well-dressed? That's not probable cause, and you both know it." As Martinez reprimanded her officers, a commotion near the front desk caught their attention. A tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit was arguing with the desk sergeant. His voice, authoritative and filled with barely contained fury, carried across the station. "I demand to see Marcus Johnson immediately," the man said, his tone brooking no argument. "I'm David Williams, senior partner at Davis & Williams, and Marcus is one of our top attorneys." The officers exchanged worried glances, the gravity of their mistake beginning to dawn on them. Thompson felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he realized the magnitude of what they had done. They hadn't just arrested an innocent man, they had arrested a high-powered attorney from one of the city's most prestigious law firms. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Marcus was going over his options. He knew he had grounds for a lawsuit, but he also knew that pursuing legal action against the police department could have far-reaching consequences. It could impact his career, his personal life, and potentially make him a target for further harassment. But at the same time, he knew that staying silent would only perpetuate the cycle of injustice. His thoughts were interrupted as the door opened, and Sergeant Martinez entered, followed by a chastened-looking Thompson and Rodriguez. The change in the officer's demeanor was immediately apparent. Gone was the arrogance and aggression they had displayed earlier. Now they looked uncertain, even afraid. Martinez's expression was a mixture of embarrassment and genuine remorse. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice careful and measured, "I want to extend my sincerest apologies for this unfortunate incident. It appears there has been a grave misunderstanding." Marcus remained silent, his face impassive. He had learned long ago that in situations like this, it was best to let the other party do the talking. Every word they said could potentially be used later if he decided to pursue legal action. Martinez continued, her discomfort growing under Marcus's steady gaze. "Your employer, Mr. Williams, is here. He's vouched for your identity and position at the firm. You're free to go, and I assure you, there will be a full investigation into this matter." As Marcus stood, he could see the shock and disbelief on the faces of Thompson and Rodriguez. The realization that they had unlawfully detained a highly respected attorney was clearly setting in. Their earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a palpable fear of the consequences they might face. Outside the interrogation room, David Williams was waiting. The older man's face was a mask of barely contained fury. His eyes blazed with anger as he took in Marcus's disheveled appearance and the marks on his wrists where the handcuffs had been. "Marcus, are you all right?" David asked, his voice tight with concern and rage. "This is an outrage. I've already contacted our legal team. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As Marcus and David left the station, word of the incident was already spreading. Officers and staff watched them go, a mixture of shame and curiosity on their faces. Many were wondering how this could have happened and what the repercussions would be. The walk out of the police station felt surreal to Marcus. Just hours ago, he had been led in handcuffs, treated like a common criminal. Now, he was leaving with one of the most powerful attorneys in the city by his side. The contrast was stark, a vivid illustration of how quickly fortunes could change and how arbitrary the system could be. As they stepped out into the late afternoon sun, Marcus took a deep breath, feeling as if he was emerging from a nightmare. The fresh air felt like a blessing after the stifling atmosphere of the police station. But even as relief washed over him, he knew that this ordeal was far from over. The eyes of passers-by lingered on him, taking in his rumpled suit and the anger evident on David's face. Marcus knew that rumors would soon be spreading, that this incident would not remain private for long. David guided Marcus to his car, a sleek black sedan parked nearby. As they drove away from the station, the adrenaline that had been keeping Marcus going began to ebb, leaving him feeling drained and shaken. "Marcus," David said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them, "I want you to know that the firm stands behind you completely. What happened to you today is unacceptable, and we're going to use every resource at our disposal to ensure that those responsible are held accountable." Marcus nodded, grateful for the support, but still processing the events of the day. "Thank you, David. I appreciate that. But I need some time to think about how I want to proceed." David glanced at him, surprise evident on his face. "What do you mean? Surely you're going to press charges? File a lawsuit?" Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know. Yes, what happened to me was wrong. But I'm also aware of the potential consequences of taking on the police department. It's not a decision to be made lightly." David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Marcus, you can't let them get away with this. Think about how many others have faced similar treatment without the resources to fight back. You have the opportunity to make a real difference here." The words hit Marcus hard. He knew David was right. He did have an opportunity here. But he also knew that taking on this fight would come at a personal cost. It would mean putting himself in the public eye, potentially making himself a target. It would mean reliving this traumatic experience over and over again as he fought for justice. As they drove through the streets of Tulsa, Marcus found himself looking at the city with new eyes. He saw the diverse faces of the people on the sidewalks, going about their daily lives. How many of them, he wondered, had faced similar experiences of racial profiling? How many had been wrongfully detained, arrested, or worse? And how many had stayed silent, too afraid or too powerless to speak out? The car pulled up to Marcus's apartment building, a modern high-rise in one of Tulsa's more affluent neighborhoods. As Marcus got out of the car, David rolled down the window. Take some time to think things over," David said, his tone softening. "But remember, you're not alone in this. The firm is behind you, whatever you decide." Marcus nodded, grateful for the support. As he watched David's car pull away, he felt the weight of the decision before him. He knew that whatever choice he made would have far-reaching consequences, not just for himself, but for his community and potentially for the entire city. Inside his apartment, Marcus finally allowed himself to fully process the events of the day. The emotions he had been holding back came rushing to the surface. Anger, fear, humiliation, and a deep sense of injustice overwhelmed him. He found himself shaking, tears streaming down his face as the full impact of what had happened hit him. For a long time, Marcus sat in his living room, staring out at the Tulsa skyline as the sun began to set. The city lights began to twinkle, a beautiful sight that seemed at odds with the turmoil he felt inside. As the initial shock began to wear off, Marcus's analytical mind began to work, considering his options and their potential outcomes. If he chose to pursue legal action, he could potentially force real change within the police department. His case could set a precedent, perhaps even lead to policy changes that would protect others from experiencing what he had gone through. But it would also mean putting himself in the public eye, opening himself up to scrutiny, and potentially making himself a target for those who would resist such changes. On the other hand, if he chose to let the matter drop, he could avoid the stress and potential danger of a public fight. He could return to his life, to his career, and try to put this incident behind him. But could he live with himself, knowing that he had the power to potentially make a difference and chose not to use it? As Marcus grappled with these thoughts, his phone began to buzz incessantly. News of the incident had spread quickly, and journalists were clamoring for a statement. He saw missed calls from colleagues, friends, and family members. The story was out there now, and he knew he would have to face it sooner or later. With a heavy sigh, Marcus picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. "Something happened today. I need your advice." Over the next hour, Marcus poured out the whole story to his mother, Linda Johnson. Linda listened quietly, her heart breaking for her son, but swelling with pride at his composure in the face of such injustice. "Oh, Marcus," she said when he had finished. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, but I'm so proud of how you handled yourself." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat at his mother's words. "Thanks, Mom, but I don't know what to do now. Part of me wants to fight this, to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else, but another part of me is scared of what might happen if I do." Linda was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "Marcus, do you remember what your father always used to say?" Marcus smiled despite himself. "Stand up for what's right, even when you're standing alone." "That's right," Linda said. "Your father faced a lot of injustice in his life, but he never let it break him. He always said that change doesn't happen when people stay silent." As Marcus listened to his mother's words, he felt a sense of clarity begin to emerge. He thought about his father, a civil rights activist who had marched with Dr. King, who had faced water hoses and police dogs to fight for equality. He thought about all those who had come before him, who had faced far worse than what he had experienced today, yet still found the courage to stand up and fight for justice. "You're right, Mom," Marcus said, a new determination in his voice. "I can't stay silent. Not when I have the opportunity to make a difference." After hanging up with his mother, Marcus took a deep breath and began to make some calls. He contacted David Williams, informing him of his decision to pursue legal action against the police department. He reached out to some of his contacts in the media, agreeing to give interviews to tell his story. And finally, he called some of his fellow attorneys who specialized in civil rights law, beginning to build the team that would help him fight this battle. As he made these calls, Marcus felt a mix of emotions. There was fear, certainly. Fear of the unknown, of the potential backlash, of the long and difficult fight ahead. But there was also a sense of purpose, a feeling that he was doing the right thing. And underlying it all was a burning determination to see this through, to turn this traumatic experience into something positive that could help others. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus's story exploded across local and national media. News vans camped outside his apartment building, reporters clamoring for interviews. Social media was ablaze with hashtags demanding justice and police reform. Marcus found himself at the center of a media storm. He gave interviews, detailing his experience and calling for accountability and change within the police department. He spoke eloquently about the broader issues of racial profiling and systemic racism, using his platform to shed light on the experiences of countless others who had faced similar injustices. The response to Marcus's story was polarizing. Many rallied behind him, praising his courage in speaking out, and demanding justice. Civil rights activists and community leaders reached out, offering their support and solidarity. But there was also backlash. Some accused him of exaggerating the incident for attention, while others argued that he should have complied more readily with the police. Throughout it all, Marcus remained focused on his goal. He worked tirelessly with his legal team, building a case against the police department. They gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and pored over police records, building a compelling argument for not just individual accountability, but systemic change. As the weeks passed, the incident sparked a broader conversation about race and policing in Tulsa. Community meetings were held where residents shared their own experiences of racial profiling and police misconduct. The city council held special sessions to discuss potential reforms to police training and oversight. Within the Tulsa Police Department, the fallout was significant. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Sergeant Martinez, despite her attempts to rectify the situation, faced scrutiny for her team's actions. The department was forced to confront long-standing issues of racial bias and questionable policing practices. 2 months after the incident, Marcus stood before a packed press conference, ready to announce the filing of his lawsuit against the Tulsa Police Department. As he approached the podium, he felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about pushing for real, lasting change. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. 2 months ago, I was wrongfully arrested while simply trying to get lunch. I was humiliated, my rights were violated, and I was treated as a criminal for no reason other than the color of my skin. Today, I am filing a lawsuit against the Tulsa Police Department, not just for myself, but for every person who has ever faced similar treatment and didn't have the resources to fight back. As Marcus detailed the specifics of the lawsuit, he could see the impact his words were having on the assembled crowd. There were nods of agreement, murmurs of support, and more than a few tearful eyes. He knew that his story resonated with many who had faced similar experiences. "But this lawsuit is just the beginning," Marcus continued. "We need systemic change. We need better training for our police officers, stronger oversight, and real accountability when mistakes are made. We need a police force that truly serves and protects all members of our community, regardless of their race or background." As he concluded his statement, Marcus felt a sense of purpose, stronger than anything he had experienced before. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for the fight. This was about more than just one incident or one lawsuit. It was about pushing for a fundamental shift in how policing was done in Tulsa and beyond. In the months that followed, Marcus's case became a rallying point for those seeking police reform in Tulsa and across the country. He worked tirelessly, not just on his own case, but in advocating for broader changes. He spoke at community meetings, consulted with city officials on potential reforms, and used his legal expertise to help draft new policies and procedures for the police department. The lawsuit itself moved slowly through the legal system, but its impact was felt long before any verdicts were reached. The Tulsa Police Department, under intense public scrutiny, began implementing changes. They revised their training programs, focusing more on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. They established a civilian oversight board to review complaints of police misconduct. And they launched a community outreach program aimed at building better relationships between officers and the communities they served. As the one-year anniversary of his arrest approached, Marcus found himself reflecting on how much had changed. The incident that had once filled him with fear and anger had become a catalyst for positive change. He had turned his pain into purpose, his humiliation into a movement for justice. But Marcus knew the work was far from over. While progress had been made, there were still incidents of racial profiling and police misconduct. There were still those who resisted change, who clung to old prejudices and outdated ways of thinking. The fight for true equality and justice was ongoing, and Marcus was committed to seeing it through. On the morning of the anniversary, Marcus stood outside the cafe where he had been arrested a year ago. A crowd had gathered, community members, activists, and even some police officers who had embraced the push for reform. As Marcus addressed the crowd, he felt a sense of hope for the future. "A year ago, I stood on this spot and experienced one of the most humiliating and frightening moments of my life," Marcus began. "But today, I stand here with hope. Hope because I've seen how we can come together as a community to demand change. Hope because I've seen officers willing to confront their biases and commit to doing better. Hope because I know that as long as we keep pushing, keep fighting for justice, we can create a better future for all of us." As Marcus finished speaking, the crowd erupted in applause. He looked out at the sea of faces, black, white, brown, young, old, all united in their desire for a more just and equitable society. And in that moment, Marcus knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was on the right path. The lawsuit against the Tulsa Police Department continued to make its way through the courts, but its impact was already being felt far beyond the legal system. Marcus's case had become a touchstone in the national conversation about race and policing, inspiring similar efforts in other cities across the country. As Marcus left the anniversary gathering, he was approached by a young black man, barely out of his teens. The young man introduced himself as Jamal and explained that Marcus's story had inspired him to pursue a career in law. "I want to fight for justice like you do," Jamal said, his eyes shining with admiration. "I want to make a difference." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to Jamal. He thought about how close he had come to staying silent, to letting fear and doubt hold him back. And he realized that this, inspiring others to take up the fight for justice, was perhaps the most important outcome of all. "The path isn't easy," Marcus told Jamal, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "But it's worth it. Remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one person at a time, one action at a time. Never underestimate the power of your voice and your actions to make a difference." As Jamal walked away, filled with newfound determination, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to be fought. But he was ready for them, because he knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was a step towards a better future. Marcus's journey from wrongfully arrested black man to civil rights advocate had been unexpected and often difficult. But as he looked back on the past year, he realized that it had also been incredibly rewarding. He had found strength he didn't know he possessed, formed alliances with people from all walks of life, and played a part in pushing for real, meaningful change. As the sun began to set over Tulsa, casting a warm glow over the city, Marcus felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to fight for justice. But for now, he allowed himself to feel proud of how far he had come, and hopeful for the future he was helping to create. The story of Marcus Johnson, from wrongfully arrested black man to catalyst for change, had become a powerful reminder of the potential for transformation that exists within each of us. It was a testament to the idea that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to stand up, speak out, and make a difference. As Marcus walked home that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey ahead would not be easy, but he was ready for it, because he knew that every step he took was not just for himself, but for all those who had faced injustice and all those who would come after. It was a heavy responsibility, but one that Marcus embraced with open arms. The fight for justice and equality was far from over, but Marcus Johnson was committed to seeing it through, one day at a time, one action at a time, until the world he dreamed of became a reality. As the months turned into years, Marcus's influence continued to grow. His lawsuit against the Tulsa Police Department had become a landmark case, setting precedents that were cited in similar cases across the country. But more than that, Marcus had become a respected voice in the ongoing national conversation about race, policing, and justice. 3 years after his wrongful arrest, Marcus found himself in Washington, D.C., testifying before a congressional committee on police reform. As he sat before the panel of lawmakers, cameras flashing in the eyes of the nation upon him, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Distinguished members of the committee, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. I come before you today, not just as an individual who has experienced racial profiling and police misconduct firsthand, but as a representative of countless others who have faced similar injustices. The issue before us is not just about reforming police procedures or implementing new training programs. It's about fundamentally reimagining the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. As Marcus spoke, detailing his experience and the changes that had been implemented in Tulsa as a result of his advocacy, he could see the impact his words were having on the committee members. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable, perhaps confronting their own biases and preconceptions. The reforms we've implemented in Tulsa, increased de-escalation training, civilian oversight boards, community policing initiatives, have shown promising results, Marcus continued. We've seen a decrease in use of force incidents and an increase in community trust. But these changes didn't happen overnight, and they didn't happen without resistance. It took sustained effort, difficult conversations, and a willingness on all sides to acknowledge past mistakes and commit to doing better. Marcus went on to outline his recommendations for national police reform, drawing on his experiences both as a victim of racial profiling and as an advocate for change. He spoke about the need for standardized training protocols, stronger accountability measures, and increased diversity within police forces. As he concluded his testimony, Marcus felt a sense of hope. He knew that change at the national level would be slow and fraught with challenges, but he also knew that the conversation was happening. People were listening, and minds were beginning to change. After the hearing, as Marcus was preparing to leave the Capitol building, he was approached by Senator Elaine Harper, a longtime advocate for criminal justice reform. "Mr. Johnson," Senator Harper said, extending her hand, "I want to thank you for your powerful testimony today. Your story and the changes you've helped implement in Tulsa could serve as a model for national reform." Marcus shook the senator's hand, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "Thank you, Senator. I'm just trying to do my part to create the change we need to see." "Well, your part is making a big difference," Senator Harper replied. "I'd like to invite you to be part of a task force we're putting together to draft comprehensive police reform legislation. Your insights would be invaluable." Marcus felt a surge of excitement at the senator's words. This was an opportunity to effect change at the highest levels of government, to help shape policies that could impact millions of lives. "I'd be honored, Senator," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "When do we start?" As Marcus left Washington and returned to Tulsa, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His fight for justice had started with a single traumatic incident, but it had grown into something much larger. He was no longer just fighting for himself or even just for his community in Tulsa. He was fighting for change on a national scale. Back in Tulsa, Marcus threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. He continued his legal practice, focusing on civil rights cases and providing pro bono representation to those who couldn't afford legal services. He also expanded his community outreach efforts, establishing mentorship programs for young people interested in law and social justice. One afternoon, as Marcus was leaving the courthouse after winning a case against a local company for discriminatory hiring practices, he was approached by a familiar face. It was Officer Mike Rodriguez, one of the officers who had arrested him that fateful day 4 years ago. Marcus felt a flutter of anxiety as Rodriguez approached, memories of that day flooding back. But as the officer drew closer, Marcus could see that something had changed. The arrogance and aggression that had once defined Rodriguez's demeanor were gone, replaced by a look of genuine remorse. "Mr. Johnson," Rodriguez said, his voice hesitant, I owe you an apology. What I did to you that day, it was wrong. I've spent the last few years really thinking about my actions, about the biases I didn't even realize I had." Marcus studied the officer, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. It was clear that Rodriguez had done some serious soul-searching in the years since the incident. "I appreciate that, Officer Rodriguez," Marcus said carefully. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong and to work on changing yourself." Rodriguez nodded, a look of relief crossing his face. "Your case? It opened my eyes. I've been working hard to unlearn my biases, to be a better officer. I even volunteered to be part of the new community policing initiative. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. As Marcus listened to Rodriguez speak about the changes he had made, about his efforts to build better relationships with the community he served, he felt a complex mix of emotions. There was still anger there, still pain from the humiliation he had endured. But there was also a glimmer of hope. If someone like Rodriguez could change, could recognize and work to overcome their biases, then perhaps real, lasting change was possible. "Officer Rodriguez," Marcus said, extending his hand. "Thank you for sharing that with me. It's not easy to confront our mistakes and biases, but it's necessary if we want to create real change. I'm glad to hear you're committed to doing better." As they shook hands, Marcus felt a sense of closure. The incident that had changed the course of his life had also, in its own way, changed Rodriguez. It was a powerful reminder that change often starts with individuals, with small moments of realization and commitment to do better. That evening, as Marcus sat in his office reviewing case files, he received an unexpected call. It was from the mayor's office, inviting him to be part of a new initiative to review and revise the city's policing policies. As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt a sense of amazement at how far he had come. From a man wrongfully arrested on the street to someone helping shape city policy, it was a journey he never could have imagined. But even as he marveled at his own path, Marcus knew that his work was far from over. There were still injustices to be fought, still minds to be changed, still systems to be reformed. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but Marcus was ready for it. As he looked out his office window at the Tulsa skyline, Marcus felt a surge of determination. He had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, and he was committed to seeing that change through, no matter how long it took. The story of Marcus Johnson, from wrongfully arrested black man to national advocate for justice, had become more than just a personal journey. It had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of resilience, determination, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. As the sun set over Tulsa, casting a warm glow over the city, Marcus smiled to himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, and he was ready for them all.